You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with some information from K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen and K-State Extension Assistant Rich Llewelyn. Roger, Rich, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, good to be here, Shelby.
Roger, Rich, both wanting today to talk about the Kansas Tax Institute, which is something K-State Research and Extension puts on in K-State Agricultural Economics Department. And Roger, first talking about some of the presenters and topics that will be covered on this day.
Well, the topics at each location and for both of the online schools are fairly constant from day one to day two. And just as an example, we're going to start out on day one with new developments in the law. What has happened in tax law, what's happened with the IRS over the past year since we last had the tax schools last fall. And of course, one of those big ones is the employee retention credit, which is right now paused because of all of the fraud that's associated with the program. IRS has decided not to process any more ERC claims until we get to January, which is causing other problems. So we're going to go through that and various types of things that came out of legislation last year involving energy credits and corporate taxes and health care and payroll tax provisions, and then Form 1099-K issues. And then another big aspect of day one at the schools, that we do have a discrepancy here. Day one for the online schools, which the first one is online and the last one is online exclusively. And then day two at the other events will be ag issues. And that is a major feature of the tax schools. In fact, for many years, the tax schools were known as the farm tax institutes. But the agriculture, obviously, is number one industry in the state. And at some point in time, I think the last survey that I remember seeing, Rich, it's been some time, that just about 90% of all farm returns in Kansas were prepared by people that went through the Kansas Tax Institutes. Now, I don't know if that survey information has been updated, but this has been a major feature of the tax schools for many, many times. And we're going to talk about such things as deducting residual soil fertility and charitable remainder trust and tax issues with easement payments, and get into death of a farmer, what happens when a farmer dies, and the associated 1041 for the trust or the estate, and unique issues such as a growing crop in a field or livestock or crops that have been contracted at the time of death but won't be delivered until after death. And what do you do with tax attributes and basis issues with property in a decedent's estate? And so that's the ag discussion. And then at day one of all of the schools, we're going to get into small business issues. And one of the aspects on that the Kansas Department of Revenue will talk about on day one at each location in the online schools will be the pass-through entity tax in Kansas. This is as a result of Congress severely limiting the deduction for state and local taxes under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so states have come up with their own workaround on that. And Kansas has their own pass-through entity tax. And so that's going to be a major part of day one, plus issues with the Corporate Transparency Act, the Form 7203, we'll get into that, and other things such as capitalization and repair. We'll review those rules. We'll have an in-depth session on partnership taxation, and then kind of a review of various depreciation topics and get into some retirement plan issues. That's all on day one of the schools.
Then, Roger, what's going to be taking place on day two?
On day two, we'll continue the discussion with respect to new developments that weren't concluded on day one, and at the online schools and out west for Hays and Garden City. We're going to break up ag issues on day one and day two. And so on day two, we'll have the second part of ag issues, and we'll get into buy-sell agreements, and as I said, 1041s for farm estates and trusts, and how you handle research and experimental as well as developmental expenses on the return. And then we'll get an update of some recent ag rulings and cases. Then some individual taxpayer issues such as estimated tax payments and how you plan for college costs from a tax standpoint, and settling a taxpayer's estate, a non-farm estate, for example. One of the things on day two that's important to tax practitioners is that they have to have information security plans in place to protect client data. And we're going to go through that on day two and what is all involved with a written information security plan. And then there'll be an IRS update on day two, and what are the new forms and instructions, the 1099 filing procedures, correspondence audits, timely mailed and received dates and statute limitations, and a little bit of discussion on OICs, or offers of compromise. There'll also be a session on independent contractors, which has become really big, particularly the last 5 or 6 years. And we'll go through the worker classification rules and the tax home issues, how you treat travel expenses and meal and entertainment expenses. And then we'll wrap up day 2 at each location with rulings and cases. It's kind of a quick-paced, fun session of what's happened in the courts, non-ag specific, that bear on tax clients. And so we'll go through rulings and cases to end each location.
And Roger, you are one of the presenters at this institute. However, you have some other experts joining you.
I do. This is my 31st year of doing this, and joining me on day 1 out west in Garden City and Hayes, as well as in the online schools, is Paul Neefer, who is formerly with Clifton Larson Allen. He's now retired from that, but he and I do a lot of seminars throughout the year together. And also the Department of Revenue. Carl York and Roger Basinger will be presenting on day 1 at each location, as well as both online schools. Day 2, I'll be at every location on day 2, as well as Kathy Murphy. Kathy Murphy is retired IRS, and she has her own tax practice in the St. Louis area now. And so we're at every location on day 2, and Paul will be with me on the online school to begin this tax schools and the online one to finish the tax schools on day 1, plus the locations in person at Garden City and Hayes on day 1. At the other schools, in person, not online, but in person at Wichita, Salina, Lawrence, and Pittsburgh, day 1 will be Ed Morse, who is a professor of taxation at Creighton Law School, as well as the Department of Revenue.
And Rich, this Kansas Tax Institute is taking place at many different locations.
We have 6 in-person locations as well as 2 online meetings. The whole series begins November 2nd with the first online meeting, and then the following week we're in Garden City and Hayes, and then we have Lawrence, Salina, Wichita, and also Pittsburgh in person, and then we end up right before Christmas with the second online session.
So a lot of different places for people to hopefully have the opportunity to attend from across the state.
Right. We try to get throughout the state so folks can attend in person if they want to, and if they're unable to do that, we do have the 2 in-person meetings or online meetings.
And this is a 2-day event for people. However, it could just be 1.
Yes, they can attend one day if they want. We offer continuing education credits, and so 8 hours of credit for each day. So for both days, it's 16 hours for accountants and tax attorneys. 15 hours of credit is available for IRS practitioners as well as certified financial planners.
And is it okay for people to make their 1-day attendance the second day of the
Yes, either day would be fine depending on which topics they'd prefer to hear.
And so for people who are interested in this, how do they go about registering for it?
We have on our website, agmanager.info. The Kansas Income Tax Institutes can be found on the first page. They can click there, and there's links for registration, also more information, as well as the brochures available there.
And what is the cost and deadline for registration?
The deadline is 2 weeks ahead of each meeting, so it's kind of a rolling deadline. And so the first one coming up will be next week on October 20th will be the deadline for the online meeting, November 2nd and 3rd. And then that's a rolling deadline. The cost for both days in person is $375, which includes meals both days, as well as materials in the continuing ed. We don't have the meals for the online meetings, so those are a little cheaper. It's $315 for 2 days of online meetings.
For people who are thinking about attending, should they have a little bit of knowledge about this before coming?
That is preferable because we do get pretty deep on some of the subject matter, obviously, and tax prep has become more complex as the years go by. And so the discussion gets pretty complex. You don't want to walk into this cold, although we do have some that aren't professional tax preparers that attend. And I think they find it helpful also, at least the feedback is to me that they find it helpful. But I wouldn't turn anybody away that's interested in it. But these are professional meetings for those that are preparing returns. And so you probably would feel lost if you showed up and you just thought you were going to have a fun day doing this and didn't really have an interest in preparing returns.
Who would you encourage to attend the 75th Annual Kansas Income Tax Institute?
CPAs, tax professionals, enrolled agents and tax preparers of all stripes. That includes attorneys, too, that do returns as part of their practice. So those would be the primary audience. We do have a handful of farmers that do attend. And we have some that work for firms that keep books for the firm. So accountants in general, whether you're a CPA or not, really doesn't matter. But if you're working with returns or you're in an office that prepares returns, you're an office assistant, you're going to find these schools pretty helpful.
Roger, Rich, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen, and he was joined by K-State Extension Assistant Rich Llewelyn, and they were discussing the upcoming 75th Annual Kansas Income Tax Institute. You can find out more information about this event by going to agmanager.info, and I will link it on agtoday.net in today's show notes.